Hey, I'm Rachel.
And I'm Amanda, and this is Beyond a Ballot.
Welcome to the Beyond a Ballot podcast. I'm Amanda Alvaro. I'm here with Rachel Siegel. Hi, Rachel. How are you?
Hello, I'm good. This week we wanted to update everyone on the situation that's on everyone's mind, and that is what's taking place in Gaza and Israel. We will be covering two angles today. One, the military operation that's taking place there, and the government response here at home in Canada. We thought there was nobody better to speak to about this than Global News' Ottawa bureau chief and host of the West Block, Mercedes Stephenson. Welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
We're so thrilled to have you.
For those who don't know, Mercedes has a strong background in military and strategic studies and is a foremost voice in political, defense, and foreign policy. She has reported from around the world, including last year from Ukraine, and has been embedded with the Canadian Special Operations Forces.
Okay, so, and your bio is just unbelievable, and I didn't want to leave anything out. So I'm just going to read another few cool facts about Mercedes. One, she traveled with the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, on his inaugural visit to the Trump White House, which we are going to have to dive into later on. She holds a master's degree in strategic studies from the University of Calgary, where she did her thesis focused on information operations in Afghanistan. Nothing too light there. You interned at the Pentagon and you studied at MIT.
She's no big deal. But if that wasn't enough to convince you, if that wasn't enough to convince you that this is the voice we need to hear from to break this down for us, then I don't know what is. Mercedes, thank you so much for being here, for taking the time. We know you are so busy. Welcome.
Oh, thanks. Well, it's, always, I think, great to have a chance to talk about these kind of world events that are coming at people 1,000 miles an hour on TV and have an opportunity to break it down and chat about it in maybe a little bit more of a digestible form.
Yeah, and you are so amazing at that. I mean, I follow you on social media, and when you're out covering a story, whether or not that's in Ottawa or during all of the truck convoy, I was watching you and you were giving information on, this is where I'm standing, this is what's happening. And then I was watching when you were in Ukraine and just going through checkpoints and trying to explain what was happening on the ground. You're so great at breaking it down for audiences. What is it about military operations and covering these global conflicts, these global events that you're so passionate about?
So for me, I think it's really about, it can seem so far removed, but your life can change in an instant. And I think we've seen that for the Ukrainians. We've seen that for the people in Israel and the people in Gaza. 1 minute you're having breakfast and the next minute there's a war. And so having the opportunity and really the honor to be able to communicate to people what is going on and just the reality and the straight facts, which is why I think reporting from the ground is so important. And, right now my colleague Danielle Hamamdjian is doing this from Israel. We can't get into Gaza, so we're unable to speak about what's happening there, but to get as close as you can and to provide people with the facts and as much context as you can, because particularly in an environment where information has become a very powerful currency, if you can't witness yourself what happened, social media is not always reliable. The clips you see on Instagram can have been edited. You don't see what happened right before it, right after it, or what was even happening on either sides of the camera. So having a professional journalist there who can look at that and who is neutral and able to deliver that without an agenda, without trying to accomplish a certain storyline, simply telling the story of what is happening, really drew me to military in particular, because those events are life and death for people. And for me, part of what drew me to it is that I initially was a bit naive and wanted to go into international human rights law. Just still a wonderful thing. But I realized after not too long that the International Criminal Court has very little teeth. And that was so disillusioning for me to realize that as a young person and having these aspirations of taking care of refugees and holding war criminals accountable. And that was a bit of a wake up call to me. And in particular around grade 12, which for me, I'll date myself here, is when the air war against Kosovo was happening. And I worked very closely with some Kosovar refugees who came to Canada who'd had a very normal life, a midwife and a butcher, twins and a little boy. And suddenly they were uprooted into this culture and country where they didn't know the language. Their house ended up being bombed by NATO. Family members were killed by the KLA and by the Serbs. They just got hit on all angles. And I think I felt very drawn to understand why that was, which is why I wanted to go into the human rights angle. And then in my first year of university, before 9/11 happened, again, telling you how old I am, I went down to NORAD on a student trip. And it was not at all what I'd expected from people in the military. I had very little exposure. People often think that, maybe my parents were military or something. I should say my parents had a 25-year age difference. So my dad was in the Air Force at the end of the Second World War. But so young, he never deployed or had any experience. And he was coaching forces when the war ended. So it was the first time I'd really been around the military. And what struck me about them was their desire to protect people. They were really interesting and amazing people who had put on their uniform for Canada and they wanted to protect. And I heard about threats there that I was unaware of. And I, had a relatively good education to that point. And I thought, if I don't know about this, other people don't know. And I really felt a strong desire to be able to communicate that so that people could be prepared, could understand, could defend ourselves, could have informed discussions about national security. And then that just kind of evolved from there. And by the way, I ended up on that trip by accident because I was in the debate club and would debate anything. And so I agreed to debate that women should be allowed to serve on the front lines of the Canadian Armed Forces because none of the guys in the military club wanted to take that angle.
Love that.
Dr. Burkeson, who was the head of the military program, then said, you should get more involved with this stuff. And that was what it was. It was that I was there arguing that women should be allowed in combat.
Good for you. And you know what? You've done such incredible work and advocacy for women in combat over the years, including a lot of the issues within the Canadian forces. We're going to have you back because I would love to talk to you about a lot of that stuff as well. But let's go to the topic at hand. Amanda, do you have a question?
Well, let's start with the big one, which is this is an evolving story, obviously. Can you give for our listeners, where are we at in this conflict? Can you give an overview of where we're at today?
Yeah, for sure. So there's essentially 4 phases that the Israeli military is undertaking. Phase 1 was that they were trying to hunt down any remaining members of Hamas who were in Israel because there was a number of people who they believed had the skills to hide and wait and then appear and attack people randomly at later dates. So they wanted to sort that out and also close the literal holes in their fence to prevent anyone else from getting through. Phase 2 was the airstrikes. And that was designed less to target Hamas commanders, although that happened as well, and more to take out some of the sophisticated weaponry that they say was in civilian areas and on the ground. And you'll notice when you watch some of the airstrikes, there's very significant secondary explosions. That's indicative of a munitions strike because a JDAM, which is the type of bomb the Israeli Air Force drops, destroys largely through kinetic energy, not through incendiary fire force. And you saw that difference, for example, with the hospital. When the hospital was struck, it didn't look right to me when I saw it. And you could see this information whipping up. And I thought, that is a lot of fire for an airstrike. That looks more like a rocket where there's a lot of fuel and it burns things. Airstrikes, more there's rubble. There can be secondary fires as a result of, a gas line going up or something like that. But not that kind of charring. So there was, sort of these heavy duty bombs being dropped to try to strike some of the infrastructure and command centers. What it's unable to reach is things like the tunnels underground, which are really sophisticated. They have phone line systems, they think now, that they can make phone calls with. There are many, many, many kilometers of them. They are reinforced with concrete. They have their own water supply. You can live down there for a long time and you can get to a lot of places. So they're now in the phase where they're going to try to move in and clear individual buildings, which is extremely complicated in Gaza. This is a very populated area with a lot of high rises where they're literally going to have to go room to room in every single building to clear it. So what they're doing right now is they are surrounding Gaza. Gaza City. And within it, they are surrounding 1 or 2 block radiuses at a time. Military refers to that as a grid movement, where they've got like this grid they put over and then they move through it. They surround it with armor, so tanks. And then the soldiers are going through door to door and they are fighting. So you're going to see a lot of people getting killed here. You're going to see a lot of Hamas dying, probably a significant number of Israeli IDF soldiers and commanders dying as well. And of course, some civilians who get caught in the middle who, both sides may be doing their best to avoid, although Hamas does deliberately embed themselves in civilian areas. And it's an extremely dangerous situation for those civilians who are now totally unable to leave. They can't. North Gaza and South Gaza were cut off as of Thursday. So that is now a hard line there. They're also going to start going down into the tunnels. And they will do that with dogs that are wearing GoPros so that they can see where the dog is going. They will use drones that they can fly through those tunnels, and they will use robots before they go through. But even still, you can imagine the hell and the terror of fighting in those tunnels. Stage 4, they won't really get into. I was trying to get them to talk about this today. Is this a counterinsurgency operation, which is more hearts and minds? Is this more traditional warfare? To what degree are we wiping out? A lot of people initially thought that Israel might want to hold Gaza and control it. That does not seem to be the case. They want to clear it of the military arm of Hamas. They started out by saying Hamas. Now they're being much more specific about the military arm of Hamas, which was estimated to me today by a senior Israeli official as between 20 to 30,000 fighters. Wow. So we're talking the size of like many countries' militaries, and very well trained, as you saw, trained significantly by the Iranians, and with pretty sophisticated weaponry there too, they believe. So the question is what happens after that? And that's actually the most complicated phase. So the bloodiest and most horrible is the one that's about to come and that we're in now. But then there's the phase of what do you do after, and reintegration. And it sounds like Israel wants to fall back, but that leaves complicated issues like power vacuums, which, as the U.S. found out in Iraq and Afghanistan, are extremely dangerous. How do you mitigate that? They say that they would like a peaceful neighbor, which of course, that's completely understandable. But there's a challenge there of potentially radicalizing more people depending on how you go about it that I saw frequently when I was covering the previous conflicts. I have no idea what the answer is, and I'm glad I'm not the person who has to find it. But it's going to be a very difficult and very long road.
So when we're talking about a ground offensive, is that what's happening right now? Because I know that everybody's been kind of waiting for Israel to go, quote, in on the ground. Is that the point that we're at in this conflict?
Yeah, exactly, Rachel. We are in the ground offensive in a relatively early stage of it. I think this will probably go for months because there is so much to clear and hold as they go, because if they don't hold, people can come in behind them. And so what a lot of people were expecting, and I think it was kind of, brilliant as an information operation. The Israelis put like 380,000 reservists or something on the border. So it looked like there was going to be this massive roll into Gaza. It's an intimidation tactic. It's a way of sealing the border. It's a way of, building up support. And if they needed to do it as well, from a military perspective, they could. But I've spoken to senior Israeli and Canadian sources who say that was never the plan to roll in. The plan has always been these limited incursions that then start to build to try to minimize casualties and to maintain control. So they're getting a lot of intelligence and then they're moving in. And at first they were pulling back out, right? Now they're moving in and they're holding a little bit more and expanding. But you're not going to see sort of this, World War II D-Day sized offensive where everyone goes over the top suddenly. It will ebb and flow, I'm told, by a very senior Canadian official who's been briefed. And when it looks like they're falling back, that will actually be deliberate. They have certain internal calculuses, which of course they're not sharing with us, but that will determine when they surge and when they pull. But it's not going to be a single level sustained effort or a clear building effort the entire time. You're going to see some flexing, but this is, yes, actively the ground operation stage we're in now.
And how unique is it that they're fighting in these tunnels? Like, have we ever seen that before, or this is really new ground that is being broken?
So very limited experience with fighting in tunnels. It has happened before because Hamas has built these tunnels, right? And the Israelis would blow them up and Hamas would rebuild them. But the scale to which they're going to be fighting in the tunnels is unprecedented. We did see the Americans doing some fighting in tunnels with ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. You'll remember there was a very senior ISIS commander killed by Cairo, the female special forces dog. I just thought I'd highlight that she was a female. they sent him into a tunnel, or her, pardon me, into a tunnel, and that was how they got that particular commander. So there is limited experience, but nothing on this scale.
Wow.
Let's talk for a minute about the blockade. One of the biggest, I think, points of confusion for a lot of our listeners and people that we talk to is who can get in, who can get out, can aid get in? We're hearing that foreign nationals are getting out. Can Gazan citizens get out? Can you just give us a rundown for those who are listening to try to understand this blockade and what it means?
Yeah, absolutely. So this blockade has been pretty complete between Israel and Egypt. People have not been able to enter in or out. And in fact, there's no journalists who've been able to enter in, right? We would love to go in and be able to document what is happening beyond what we are hearing from the Palestinian Health Authority, which is controlled by Hamas, and the IDF, both of whom have a very strong interest in shaping the narrative. And we're unable to verify with our own eyes because nobody will let us in. So it's pretty sealed, except for that small amount of aid that we've seen getting in, which, as we know, did not get in at all for the first several weeks. In terms of getting out, also extremely limited. And part of what's been interesting here is how long the Israelis have waited. And that tells you how convinced they are that they have it sealed, that no one's like leaving and escaping. And just as a side note to that, part of that is that they believe the senior Hamas leadership is in fact in Beirut and Qatar. They're not even in Gaza.
Right.
So they're not going to get them in this raid because they're somewhere else, which raises a whole other question about possible dark ops going on abroad in other countries looking for these individuals, which the Israelis have a long history of doing. But, there really isn't anybody getting out either. A few foreign nationals have gotten out. It's not entirely clear how that original list that included Jordan and a few other countries was made. The initial folks out, of course, were not Canadian. And, it's been, these are Canadian citizens who can't get out, right? American citizens can't get out. And so it really has been just completely sealed off. It's like it's, zip-locked all the way around the edges. And there's just been sort of these very tiny movements in and out. But overall, there's been, pretty much nothing moving in the grand scheme of things compared to what would normally be going in, particularly to Gaza, which relies very, very heavily on international aid, both for people's income, food, water, all of those things. And I think it's also important to point out, in the interest of balance, that Hamas does still have water, electricity, and fuel that they will not share with the civilian population. But that said, that civilian population relies very heavily on aid that typically would be coming through the Israeli side.
So I want to talk about Canadians getting out of Gaza and why we weren't on that list. But when we talk about the Canadian government, but first, let's just touch on the aid piece. So what are Palestinian civilians experiencing on the ground in Gaza in terms of their access to food, internet, water, basic necessities of life? What does that look like right now for them?
So first part is it depends on whether you're in North Gaza or South Gaza, although it's just awful everywhere right now. I mean, there's no part of Gaza that is peaceful or civilians are not terrified that they're going to be killed. So you have in North Gaza a extremely heavy bombing campaign and now ground operations. You have Hamas trying to use you as a civilian shield and a human shield. You have Hamas threatening to kill you if you try to leave if you're a civilian, blocking roadways, blowing up convoys that are trying to leave to force people into staying. On top of that, even if you can get out, where are you going, right? You're going to South Gaza where there's really nowhere for you to be lodged or food or water. So for people in North Gaza, they are literally in the middle of a war zone right now. For people in South Gaza, they have slightly more protection in terms of there's less bombs falling, but you have a huge number of people who have moved to an area that really is not equipped to support them. People who aren't sure where Hamas is and therefore are at risk of being close to a target when a strike comes in. And as much as you try to deconflict where those targets are, if you're the Israeli army, the reality is when you drop a JDAM on something, there is collateral damage. That's just the reality of using JDAMs. And you can make the argument there is or there isn't a military imperative in this case, but regardless, they're very effective, but they also kill whoever else is in that building. And for the folks who we've been talking to, Canadians who are in Gaza, there's just a very deep sense of fear, of terror, of the fact that they're trapped, that they assumed that having the Canadian passport would allow them to get out, and now they can't. And really struggling to find food, water, things we forget about because, we're pretty lucky here. But I remember from being in the field, hygiene, right? When you can't take a shower or you can't get your kids clean, you start talking about infections taking hold, gastro, all kinds of other stuff that layers on top of that and makes life harder.
Mercedes, you said something that you were talking about journalists wanting to be in Gaza, and you said we would love to be there. Tell me about that for a minute. Would you, if given the chance, would you be there?
Yeah, ask my boss, who I, in a heartbeat, whenever something like this comes up. And it's not because I enjoy conflict or suffering or I'm crazy, although perhaps maybe crazy, but for other reasons. But it's this importance of bearing witness to what is happening and showing that. And verifying the truth. And it's particularly difficult when you're dealing with a group like Hamas. And this goes to, Rachel was talking about my thesis, right? Information operations in Afghanistan. What I was looking at is how the media gets influenced by narratives and who gets the narrative out first, and how once that narrative is out, the truth coming out doesn't always counter it or is not covered to the same level. And in this war, which has been very visual as a result of both Hamas recording their atrocities because they were proud of it and wanted to show them off to terrify people, and the Israeli government's choice to show them, to show how terrible this is, and so that people would feel, what they went through and perhaps be more sympathetic to some of the undertakings that they're doing in Gaza, we are unable to deconflict the truth about what is going on because we can't get near it. And I found this in Ukraine too, to be fair, to an extent. The Ukrainian government was clearly the victim and being attacked by Russian aggressors who were, no doubt, in my mind, I saw it, violating human rights. But we couldn't actually get close to see what was happening. You couldn't get a real sense of what the casualties were or what was actually going on. So those information blackouts make it very difficult because then we're left in sort of this vacuum of spin of people telling us what's going on or selectively released information, photos, whatever. And we don't know. We don't really know how many civilians have died in Gaza. We don't know how many IDF have died in Gaza. We don't know how many Hamas have died in Gaza. When I was talking to senior Israeli officials, they told me it's a little bit lower than 100 senior Hamas commanders who have died, but no information about how many Hamas fighters have died, that it's, more than 20 IDF who have died. What does that mean? So there's just a lot of information that we really don't have, and an inability to verify things that are being presented as facts to justify action by both sides. And that's really problematic because we just have no idea what the truth is in terms of our ability to lay eyes on it and show people.
So where do you look for some of that information? We have a lot of people talk to us about social media accounts to follow, or where to find their information, or how do they get the most accurate information at this time from somebody who's a pro, who's in it, who is storytelling about it, who's taking that information to the masses. Where do you go when you're virtually blockaded from the truth?
Yeah, and it's particularly difficult in television, right? Because we work in pictures. That's how we tell stories. So now we're relying on pictures that we can't verify to show things. And we maybe know that it's showing what you see in the picture, but it may not be the whole context. And we have seen, information operations coming out of Gaza where things are not represented as they are. Where there is information that appears to be countered in videos that come out later. The hospital is one example, right? People looked at those images and said it's an Israeli airstrike. People looked at the image of the convoy coming out. And if you don't know what to look for there, it looks like it could be an airstrike. If you've ever seen an IED go off, it actually looked a lot like an IED. And that's a very powerful information operation saying, the Israelis are striking people who are trying to flee. Don't flee. That's super powerful for Hamas to convince people not to move. Whereas if you were on site, like, well, that's weird. Where's the crater from the bomb? Where's this? Where's that? And the same with the Israelis saying, we're doing everything we can to avoid civilian casualties. Well, we're not there to be able to see how they're actually handling the civilians. So the answer is that we have to be very careful with what we select. And the reality is it's impossible to totally verify it because you aren't there. And it's something we talk about all the time. Literally every day we have conversations about this in the newsroom in Ottawa. We have conversations on a senior editorial call about what footage we choose to use and don't. We talk to Canadians who are on the ground there to try to get their perspective. And the other thing you have to realize is like in life, and particularly in traumatic events, people are informed by their own experience, and each person's experience is unique. And it could be two people that are right next to each other and they experience it very differently or interpret it very differently. And the Middle East is also a very complicated place. So when you're talking to people too, you're trying to verify who are they really. And you don't always, you have to know, you don't always have all of the information about affiliations or sympathies. And so we do our best to try to verify information and people and who they are and what their viewpoints might be. For example, we had a lot of information that was sent to us by some Canadians who are in Gaza that they could verify. Here's my family, right? Here I am. They are terrified. Sometimes you would also get information that was being produced, by not them. And you say, where did this picture come from? Well, my friend's friend's friend. Okay, well, we can't use that because we can't verify that picture is even real. It very well may be, but it's irresponsible for us to put it on the air. So it's extremely challenging to deal with that. And it's something that we worry about every day. And I think the hospital event made the media really think. And I don't want to overemphasize here that we're not concerned about that with the Israelis too. We look at whatever information they're giving us and know that they are a very sophisticated information operator and that they are the ones denying access into Gaza right now. But it makes it really complicated, and there is a risk that things could be wrong.
I want to kind of shift to the domestic focus because we talked a lot about the hospital. And, that was the prime minister came out and then kind of changed his position on that after an investigation into what happened. Yesterday, or a couple of days ago, we saw the prime minister make a lot of people were saying it was a shift in his tone, the way he was talking about the conflict. How do you feel Canada's response has been? And do you think that our government is shifting in the way that they're operating?
I do think there's been a shift in tone. And there was as well in a speech that Melanie Joly gave over the past week. It was a very clear shift in tone. It's not that they are not supporting Israel or saying that Israel has a right to self-defense, but the calls for a humanitarian pause and about concerns about what's happening in Gaza have certainly gotten more prominent. I was actually interested by how stridently they came out in support of Israel initially. I wasn't necessarily expecting that from this government, which isn't a good thing or a bad thing. It just wasn't necessarily consistent with what I've seen in the past. Harper government, I 100% would have expected that because of their relationship with Israel. With the Trudeau Liberal government, I didn't necessarily expect that. And then you've seen the softening of the position. And that raises the question, why is it softening? Is it because what's happening in Gaza is going on and on and on, and the people there are suffering tremendously as a result? Is it the more cynical view that the prime minister went to a mosque and he was booed? He's concerned about voting. Is it that this is an overall shift that the international community is taking as well? You've seen the White House soften their tone as well. I don't know why they're doing it, but there's definitely been a change. And when I spoke to senior Israeli officials earlier today, they had told us as journalists when the conflict first started that the main thing that they wanted from Canada was not like military support or anything. They wanted Canada to speak out publicly in support of Israel. They wanted that sort of Canadian diplomacy. So we asked today, do you feel that you're still getting what you wanted from the Canadian government given the shift in tone? And they didn't deny the shift in tone, but they said, we are confident, that the government of Canada still supports Israel and says that Israel has a right to defend itself, and kind of left it at that. But the looks on the faces were a little bit different than before. You kind of see as they thought about it. But overall, it seems like it's still within the arcs of what they've agreed upon behind closed doors. And they did tell us that they have shown that 40 minutes of very brutal footage of the massacre carried out by Hamas in Israel to senior Canadian government officials as well, and that they were shocked and horrified by it.
No doubt.
I feel like there's been, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, a bigger global call for a ceasefire. Can you talk a little bit about that? Do you think that has been like a global shift in tone? And do you think that is a campaign that's existing just in media or just in social media, or really talks that governments are having amongst themselves and with others?
I think there's very real talks about this because, if you want to boil it down to the very crass kind of concerns, our citizens are there. American citizens are there. They're worried about that. They are worried about diaspora politics here. They are worried about how long this goes on for civilians in Gaza. They are worried about trying to strike the balance of supporting Israel, who was attacked, and where it was really a very clear attack on civilians mostly, who were defenseless in absolutely horrific ways. And understanding that, when this is the worst day the Jewish people have experienced since the Holocaust, why Israel is having this never again reaction, with at the same time, people in Gaza who are innocent and trapped by Hamas, who's decided to plant themselves in the middle of civilian areas and can't get out. So I think that there is very much a real conversation about this. And I actually think that Israel is engaged in it as well. They're aware and they know, the sources I've talked to say they've known all along that this shift was going to come. There is a limited amount of time that they had to act, and they had to also calibrate how strongly they were going to go in based on whether or not that would undermine their support. I think that's part of why you're seeing the ground operation now too, right? It's more specific. It's not big bombs dropping on civilian areas. It's more controlled. You're able to look in a window more and say, like, Hamas fighters are not wearing uniforms. They're not easy to spot, but you can see, like, okay, that's a family sheltering with their children. That is not a threat. Move on. So I think that there very much is global concern about this. To be perfectly blunt, I suspect Israel doesn't care what Canada has to say, but they definitely care what the White House has to say, because that's their security guarantor, who's been moving in carrier battle groups and shooting down missiles that are heading their way. And with Antony Blinken heading back to the region, I think that that's a signal that they're concerned. And I think that you've seen a change in tone at the White House as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. How much weight Canada really carries in this conflict? Because we saw a bunch of foreign nationals get out at the Rafah crossing go into Egypt from Gaza, and Canadians were not included in that. Is that a diplomatic issue? Is that because Canada doesn't carry the same global power that it could?
I mean, I think there's no doubt that a lot of our allies are frustrated with Canada right now when I talk to them about things like defense spending and then therefore the weight that carries. I don't know that it connects to why our citizens didn't get out. Like Jordanians were on the list. That doesn't surprise me because Jordan was central to these negotiations, right? So we're the first people getting out really about the countries that negotiated this. I asked Israeli officials why Canadians weren't out, and they just kind of shrugged, like they didn't know. So I don't know how much of that was Israel, because keep in mind, it's Egypt who's making the decision on who's leaving.
Right.
And I'm not sure that, we necessarily have the strongest relationship with the Egyptian government, or that most Western nations do, that we just frankly don't talk to them that much because they're not G7, they're not Five Eyes, they're not, these alliances that are constantly having discussions. I think a lot of people view Canadians as, like, at best, sweet and polite and not threats, and at worst, kind of irrelevant. So I think we're not super high up on the list of people who Egyptians would be worried about leaving, but we're probably not super prominent either in those negotiations. Melanie Joly was in the region and she was talking to people, but if we get out soon, it usually has to be that the Americans basically go in there and are like, hey, let Canada out, because they're the ones who have sort of the big stick in all of this and the big influence. So yes, frustration for sure from allies, but I'm not sure if the reason why Canadians didn't get out is connected to that versus us just not really being that central in those negotiations, and therefore not at the top of the list of countries who are making sure that their citizens were getting out.
Do we know what the numbers are of Canadians who are looking to get out of Gaza at this point?
Yeah, so this shifts all the time, and we don't have an exact breakdown from the government. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is we know how many Canadians have asked for help, and we know how many are registered. But there can be people who, as you know, like I go to places all the time and I don't register with the embassy that I'm there. So there could be people who are not registered that are there. There could be people who are registered who left. But what we do know is it fluxes. So I'm going to give you the range that it seems to go at over the days. Somewhere between 430 to 460 Canadians, permanent residents, and family members are in Gaza asking for help. It used to be that they were saying only Canadians were going to get out. They then expanded it to permanent residents, and then they expanded it to include family members. They haven't told us what family members mean. I'm guessing by those numbers, it's fairly immediate family, like spouses, children, maybe maybe grandparents. I don't think we're talking about like aunts and uncles and nieces and large extended families. But we don't have a breakdown inside that number of how many of those are actually the Canadian citizens. But that's the total number that Canada has agreed to try to get out, who have strong connections to Canada or live here.
So how does this all end? Like, what's the end game? What are we working towards? How do we get out of this, in your opinion?
I think honestly, it's not going to end in our lifetimes. It started before any of the three of us were born. This is a conflict with a very long, very bloody history, with very dug in views. You know, my concern is where the threats against Muslim and Jewish people around the world are going. Yeah. In particular, some of the videos we've seen of anti-Semitic incidents, like in Dagestan, where they surrounded a plane, Dagestan, Russia, looking for Jewish people on the plane to drag off and beat. Like that is terrifying, and it really raises concerns about that latent anti-Semitism, and too, there could be latent Islamic. You know, the Islamophobia report just came out from the Senate about Islamophobia in Canada. That can go a very dangerous direction. And while certainly there's a possibility that the conflict could spread in the region, to the West Bank, to Lebanon, it could become a broader regional war. What I'm hearing from sources is that they don't think that Iran really wants a broader war, or that Lebanon does, or Egypt. So that may contain that somewhat, but it's obviously war, and war is extremely unpredictable. So to me, the bigger concern about where it goes is sort of violence against these minority groups around the world, being targeted, and people feeling emboldened to engage in hate speech that, you know, has no place in Canada. I'm a journalist. I'm all for expression of opinions, but that's the part that concerns me, and the fracturing too. I think this is such an emotional issue for a lot of people that it's not being discussed as, you know, looking at the facts. It's sort of, what camp are you in? Pick a side. And I think that that's very difficult to navigate around and where it could go. But I think that, you know, the broader, you know, feelings there hopefully will be things that society starts to talk about and work through, and you know, designates that hate speech, whether it's being charged or not, is just not something that is acceptable in our society and in our time in 2023. But I think the conflict in the Middle East is, you know, tale as old as time, that is going to continue to go on. And I think that this is going to be a very long war with possible insurgency following after that.
One question I have related to what you just said is a question that we've heard from our listeners, which is, why aren't any of the other surrounding Arab nations getting involved at this point? Can you address that for our listeners?
Absolutely. So behind the scenes, they are involved in talking. For example, Egypt is very involved in the discussions about the release of hostages. Qatar is not an immediate neighbor, but they're very influential with Hamas in this, and they're involved as well in negotiating to try to get hostages released, which, side note, is a little bit difficult because they're not actually held entirely by Hamas. Palestinian Islamic Jihad has a number of them. There's criminal groups that may. And the Israelis say that they hold Hamas responsible for all of this, but it's not really clear that taking the hostages was actually the plan to begin with. If you get a hold of their document that the Hamas fighters had going in, they were planning to take hostages in Israel and use them as human shields. There's no reference to them taking 240 people back to Gaza.
Wow.
So they may have been unprepared for this and now be trying to figure out what to do with it. So Qatar and Egypt and Jordan have been involved in those discussions. They've also been involved in not so much like we use the term ceasefire, and then I always nerd out on people in the newsroom and say ceasefire is not what would happen, because that has to do with negotiations for peace. What would likely happen is a humanitarian pause where the fighting stops, but there's not actual negotiations happening, because I don't think either side is interested in negotiating right now. So I think that these countries are staying quiet for a few reasons. One, if you're Egypt, remember the Arab Spring. They're very afraid of movements in their country that could challenge what are, in cases, relatively authoritarian governments. So they are going to allow for sort of the exercise of protests, supporting Palestinians and Gaza, but they, behind the scenes, maybe negotiating with Hamas to say, let these people go. So they're worried about their own domestic populations. The other reason is if you're Egypt, the Egyptians could have allowed the people to come out of Gaza, right? They could
Right.
have allowed people in to the Sinai. They are not interested. They have a very large, as do the Jordanians, Palestinian refugee population. And they've pretty explicitly said behind closed doors, we are not interested in having more Palestinians. The Egyptians in particular are worried about Hamas infiltration and what that would mean for Muslim Brotherhood, that they could link up there. So they're saying one thing publicly, privately, they have security concerns too. And unfortunately, that means that these civilians are paying the price, just locked in, because while these countries publicly want to speak out to it, none of them are offering to say, well, we'll bring them here.
Right.
Right.
We get asked that a lot. Like, why can't they leave? Where can they go? Can they go anywhere? Why won't anyone take them? There's the answer.
Yeah. We're getting very short on time, but we have to talk about the hostages, because I think another, like, maybe this is our final question on this, but how does this end for them? How do we get them out? What's life like for these hostages? We've had a couple of hostages that were freed that talked about their experiences in Gaza. How much of that do we believe? Can you comment on your feelings around the whole hostage situation?
That's interesting, because you saw the info op by Hamas where they recorded that young woman saying she was being treated well. Like, it's like the kidnapping video where you say, oh, my kidnappers are not hurting me. You're going to say whatever you're told to say when there's a gun to your head. Exactly. So there's a few things with the hostages. One is trying to identify where they are and who they're being held by. And so how they're being treated could vary drastically, depend on, are they being held by members of Hamas who say they weren't supposed to be brought back here, we need to make sure they have medical care and are treated relatively well? Are they being held by more extreme factions within Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who could be engaged in much more horrific activities with these hostages? They are likely underground in tunnels and haven't seen the light in weeks. I spoke to a hostage negotiator for the FBI who said that there will start to be serious mental health problems right now. The initial trauma, you kind of go into lockdown and don't feel it. But about 2 to 3 weeks in is when PTSD starts to manifest very heavily. And considering they are still in captivity, you can imagine the magnitude of that. And not to mention just the magnitude of being kidnapped. It's what they saw before that. There could be very serious health problems. I saw that 43-minute video from Hamas body cams and CCTV that was presented by the Israeli government. And there are very clearly very severely wounded hostages being taken back, including people who are missing arms and legs. Whether or not they've survived, we don't know. There's obviously a lot of concerns about sexual violence with women. The IDF has managed to rescue a few, and a few have been spontaneously released by Hamas. Hamas's tactic of saying, if you cease fire, we'll release the hostages didn't work. There's a big debate in Israel right now. Netanyahu's government basically just wanted to roll in and say, I should say that his party, because now there's a wartime government that's a cross-party, they were largely willing to potentially sacrifice those hostages, according to the sources I spoke to. But the political pressure in Israel is immense. It was immense when just one soldier was taken, so it's far more immense when you're talking about 240 people, many of whom are children, babies, civilians, elderly people, mentally and physically disabled people. This is something they feel very passionately about. And if the Israeli army accidentally kills a bunch of them, that is not going to go down well in Israel. So they have managed to rescue a few. I think they will continue, and that's part of the block by block strategy, is to try to find them, but it's tough because you can move them, right? You hear people coming, move them to the hotel, move them somewhere else. And one of the things that we were taught in our war training for journalism is you never want to be rescued. You want to be released. And the reason is the rescue is actually the most dangerous time for the hostage, when you are the most likely to be killed, either deliberately by the hostage takers trying to prevent your rescue or by accident by your rescuers. So it always seems like the option you want, but it actually might not be.
Mercedes, I have to say, like, of anyone that we've talked to on this podcast, you're just such an incredible wealth of education and information, and you have such a brilliant way of sharing that knowledge. It's remarkable.
I feel like I've learned an incredible amount tonight, and I would say I thought I was pretty informed about this conflict, but wow, I mean, just your knowledge on the types of bombs being used or weapons being used, and like the impact of that, how you can tell by looking at something just looking at the video, it's crazy. I never even considered that. So your knowledge on this and you sharing that with us is just invaluable to us. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm always glad to talk about this stuff. I think that it's fascinating, and you have such great questions about it that really illuminate where the issues are. So thank you for your amazing questions.
Thank you. We'll have to have you back to tell us more about your time at the Pentagon and your experience with Trudeau and Trump. I had so many personal questions I had to ask you, but we'll save that for a lighter topic another time.
And I hope you'll come
right.
back to share as this conflict evolves. I hope you'll come back to share with our listeners. I have no doubt that they will be very moved by this conversation today.
Anytime. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And thanks to Danny Horowitz and Jonathan Panetta for our music, and to Tim Truax, our producer. We will be speaking to you next week.
Thanks, guys.